We're going to take a look at how do we divide when there's decimals in our dividend or our divisor. So basically that means how do we divide when we're dividing with a decimal or dividing into a decimal. So when we're dividing with money, I almost ignore the fact that it's money at first and just think of it as a division problem. So how many times does 5 go into 35 and 65 cents? Now when you're using the algorithm, there's a nice trick. All I have to do is put my decimal point up on top when I first start dividing. Now I'm going to divide as if it's a normal problem. Well, 5 can't go into 3, but can 5 go into 35? Yeah, it can go in 7 times. So then I'm going to subtract, bring down my next number. Can 5 go into 6? It can go in 1 time. So 5 times 1 is 5. I'm going to subtract and bring down my next number. Can 5 go into 15? It can go in 3 times. I already have my decimal point where it needs to go, so it's $7.13. So the key here is place your decimal before you start dividing. Take a look at this one. You set up the problem like it was a normal problem, and then before you start dividing, you place your decimal right where it needs to go so that they're really lined up right on top of each other. When you divide, it's like almost every number needs a hat. So the decimal needs to line up with the other decimal. That's its hat. So can 3 go into 1? No. So I can't put anything over the 1, but can 3 go into 12? Yes, it can go in 4 times. 4 times 3 is 12. Then I subtract, bring down the next number. 3 goes into 4 1 time, so 4 minus 3. Bring down, 3 goes into 18 6 times. So I have my answer of $4.16 because my decimal's already where it needs to be. When you're not working with money, it's a little different. So I'm going to set up my problem just like I had before. So how many times does 6/10 or 0.6 go into 18? Now the thing is, when we divide, it's really messy to have a decimal point. So it's easier to ignore the decimal and get rid of it completely. So I first have to do something with it. I can't just delete it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my decimal point over 1 spot so that it's not 0.6 anymore, it's 6. But I have to keep things fair. So whatever I do to one number, I have to do to the other number. So since it's a whole number, I can imagine that there's a decimal point at the end. Any number can have a decimal point at the end of it. So since I moved the 6 decimal point over once, I also have to move this one over once and fill it up with a 0 because I need to hold my place value. So all of a sudden, this changes to how many times does 6 go into 180 because I moved each decimal point 1 spot. 0.6 became 6, 18 became 180. It's like I made them 10 times bigger. Now I can just go ahead and solve my problem the way I normally would. How many times does 6 go into 1? It can't. So how many times does 6 go into 18? That's 3 times. I subtract. 6 goes into 0, 0 times, so I get my answer of 30. So again, I don't have to think about a decimal. I already took care of it. My answer would just be 30. Take a look at this one. Now I have 6/100ths, or 0.06. So here's that decimal point, and I really don't want to divide by a decimal, so I need to get rid of it. So I need to move my decimal point over 1, 2 spots so that it just becomes a 6. So whatever I do to one number, I have to do to the other. So since I moved this over 1, 2 spots, I need to move this over 1, 2 spots, fill those scoops with zeros. So my new problem says, how many times does 6 go into 1,800? Now I just divide as if it's a normal division problem. So I get my answer of 300 and I'm done. I don't have to put a decimal point in. I already took care of it when I moved the decimal points over. This time it's almost like I made each one 100 times bigger. 6/100ths became 6 whole and 18 became 1800. Both got 100 times bigger. So for this one, the same steps I've been following. I set up my problem. I gotta get rid of this decimal here. It's really hard to divide by decimals, so I need to move it. So I'm going to move it 1 spot, and then I need to move this 1 spot, fill the scoop with a 0 if there's nothing there. So now I'm saying how many times does 9 go into 2,340? I like to rewrite it just because it gets a little confusing with all my scoops. So now I can solve it like a normal problem. And I can say that would be 2 times would give me 18. Then that would be 5, bring down the 4. 9 goes into 54 6 times. Bring down the 0, and it's 0. So my answer is 260. This one's a little different because if you notice, it's the same numbers from the last problem, but now both numbers have a decimal point, but it doesn't change what I'm doing. So I'm going to write it down the same way I had been writing it down. Again, I can't have that decimal point in what I'm dividing by, so I need to move it. So if I move this one spot, I have to move this one spot. So all I have to do is move it, and it actually becomes easier. I don't have to write any zeros because there was already a number there. It's just how many times does 9 go into 234, and I get my answer of 26. For this problem, you'll notice that now I'm not dividing by a decimal, so I really don't have to move my decimal point. Now I solve it very similarly to the same way I was doing money before. If I don't have to move a decimal point by the number I'm dividing by, well then all I have to do is put my decimal point up top and then solve like it's a normal problem. So 4 can't go into 2, so can 4 go into 27? Well yeah, it can go in 6 times, and that's 24. 3, bring down the 2, so now I ask myself, can 4 go into 32? And it can go in 8 times. 4 times 8 is 32, and I have my answer. My decimal is already where I need it to be, so my answer is going to be 0.68 or 68 hundredths. So here are your tricks for dividing decimals. If it's money, just kind of ignore it. Place it on the top or place it back in after. Just like we showed you, if you just put it on the top of the line, it makes it easier. You don't want to divide by a decimal, so move the decimal point. Just be sure to move it the same amount of spaces on both numbers so that it's equal. And last but not least, if you're dividing a whole number into a decimal, just like we just saw, the decimal point won't bother you, so just place it in on top of the line just like we just did. If you follow all these steps, then dividing with decimals should be super easy.